Good evening. Or good morning, or whatever time of day it is. It doesn't really matter. Hi, my name is Josh. It is good to have you with us here on this Halloweekend. And I just want to, thank you. I love it when my mom's in the crowd and gets that thing started. That's really kind of you, Mom. Thanks. We're really glad that you're here this weekend, and this weekend is the weekend right before Halloween, and we thought we'd actually make a deal of it. Here's why. Halloween in this country is an interesting amalgamation of a number of things. 3 things, in fact, that I would like to maybe draw your attention to. So the first thing is All Saints' Eve. All Saints' Day is celebrated on November 1st, and All Souls' Day is celebrated on November 2nd. This is celebrated in different ways by both Catholics and Protestants. So Catholics often celebrate this by sometimes saying prayers for the saints. Protestants don't typically pray for those who have passed on before, but on All Saints' Day, a lot of Protestants choose to pray prayers of thanksgiving or gratitude. So it's often, I will, on All Saints' Day, pray thanksgiving for the people in my life who were followers of Jesus, who helped me, who I found really compelling, who connected me to the story of Jesus, that have passed on before me. Some of you have parents or grandparents or aunts and uncles or former pastors or Bible study teachers or Sunday school teachers who maybe on All Saints' Day, November 1st this year, you can just think to give a little prayer of thanks to God for those people that he's brought into your life. But on All Saints' Eve, there is this wrestling that happens with those who have gone before, a reminder of our own mortality. And so Halloween, which happens on All Saints' Eve, is in part a reflection of All Saints' Eve, but that's not the only place it draws influence from. It also draws influence from Samhain. So Samhain is a Celtic or a Gaelic holiday tradition, and truthfully, scholars have all kinds of disagreements about how this was celebrated throughout hundreds and hundreds of years. But probably the whole dressing up in costumes and going door to door, that probably came from Samhain. They also used to have their version of a jack-o'-lantern, but instead of using pumpkins, because this happened in Ireland, they didn't have pumpkins like we do here in the U.S. They use other vegetables in order to do that. So that's Samhain, that's part of it. And then another big influence on Halloween in this country is just America, right? Like, we just we have a real habit of taking a lot of different, disparate things and concocting something new and then cranking the volume to 11. That's just kind of what we do on things. And so these kinds of influences started Halloween here in the United States. And then, because we still control most of the entertainment in the world, most of the movies in the world, Halloween, as it's celebrated in the United States, ended up getting kind of exported out to other countries who saw us through their movies that they watched, and they started to celebrate it in their own countries. So Halloween is now a global phenomenon in kind of the way that we celebrate it here in the U.S. in many, many countries. Now, when I was growing up, I was part of a church that had a real hefty suspicion of Halloween. But what we found in the last number of years is actually there are a number of things about Halloween, about spooky stories, about horror movies that are actually very helpful for people as they grapple and wrestle with the world as they experience. So just very briefly, I want to tell you 3 ways that we found this, like actual research has been done, to be helpful, like spooky stories, for instance. So number 1, spooky stories tend to draw a pretty fine line in the sand and differentiate between good and evil. And in a postmodern world where so much of truth seems up for grabs, or truth seems very relative to the cultural constructs that are within your particular purview, this reminder that there is actual evil in the world and that evil should be confronted with good can be very helpful for people. And if you're a follower of Jesus, especially, there's a helpful reminder around this time of year that there are non-Christ-like ways to live, and that we as followers of Jesus should not enter into that, but rather we should stand on the teachings of Jesus and try to live our lives in such a way that it is honoring to God and reflective of the kind of kingdom that he's inviting us into. So there is a helpful element of Halloween, of spooky stories that has this good versus evil. There's another helpful element this time of year, and that's this idea of facing death. It's helpful to face death. Why? Because so much of our time is spent avoiding the topic of death. In fact, in the United States and in the West generally, we try to, right? What do we put up on our billboards? What's in our advertisements? It's very young people, good-looking people. We try to pretend that we're all immortal. And in fact, most of us feel pretty immortal for large swaths of our adult life. So this time of year, when we're kind of wrestling with death and reminding ourselves, like, actually, we don't have forever. Like, we are, as the scriptures say, like, we are like dust in the wind or vapor in the wind. We are here but a short amount of time to remind yourself that you had a beginning and your time on this earth in the way that you are now will have an end. Like, there's a wrestling with that. We need to occasionally look that in the face and remind ourselves that that is true. And this time of year brings a kind of natural, healthy way of potentially doing that as you think through the fact that you will not be here forever. So as we, for instance, pray thanksgiving for those saints who went on before us. We say, God, thank you for their life and what they meant to us. We're reminded that we don't have forever either. And we hope that maybe someday someone will pray a prayer of thanksgiving for the positive impact that we had on their life. All right, and then the third thing that I think is helpful is resilience. In fact, grappling with your own fear can be very helpful and make you more resilient. So, for instance, a number of you may be aware of, in psychology, the idea of exposure therapy. You take something that you're afraid of, and you have a fear that's not necessarily rational of something. And one way a lot of times, our tendency is to avoid that thing then. Like, I'm afraid of it. I don't want to see it. Like, so if you're afraid of heights, you don't go into high places. If you're claustrophobic, you don't get into tight spaces. But exposure therapy says, actually, exposing yourself to a tight space when you're claustrophobic for a small amount of time, supervised with somebody else, like, there's someone who can walk you through that because it exposes you to your fear. And in doing so, it robs your fear of its power. So one of the things that this time of year can help us with is that it exposes us to some of the things that we're afraid of, like the good versus evil idea, like the idea that we are not immortal, we won't live forever, like exposes us to the concept of our own death. These things can be really helpful. In fact, Dr. Colton Scrivener actually did a research project in 2020, and what he found is, as the pandemic was ravaging North America, he found that fans of horror movies reported experiencing less pandemic-related psychological distress than non-fans. In other words, those who had intentionally exposed themselves a little bit to their own fears of death, their own fears of terror, like, they actually dealt with the beginning of the pandemic a little bit better than those who hadn't. Now, eventually, the pandemic just kept going and going and going, and eventually we were all just a blubbering mess. But for a while, at least, it was very helpful for those who had exposed themselves to a little bit of their fear. And here's what we've kind of learned. We've kind of learned that spooky stories can teach us a lot about ourselves. Perhaps this is why the Bible is actually full of spooky stories. But they're not meant to just be read as entertainment. They're meant to be held up as a mirror. We can see ourselves in the story. So this morning, I want to tell you 2 spooky stories from the book of Daniel. We're going to look at stories from Daniel chapter 4 and chapter 5. We're going to tell them in a bit of a dramatic fashion. This is not normal for us, so if it's your first week, welcome. Next week will be a little less blacklighty in here, okay? But my hope is that in doing so, in telling these stories in dramatic fashion, the stories might kind of leap off the page to us. They might become more alive to us. Something for you to know before we jump into these stories is that these stories are about the kings of Babylon. And I know what you're thinking. Babylon is my favorite ancient empire. Good for you. That's so exciting. We are so stoked that we're talking about them today. Israel was conquered, actually, by the Babylonians in the 6th century BC. And so Israel was the nation that God had set aside as evidence that he was going to save the world. Israel is the nation that birthed Jesus, right? Like, Israel is where the Jewish people is where Jesus comes from. But because they kept failing over and over, God eventually removed his hand of protection, and the Babylonians overtook them. So a small, quick timeline of that. In 605 BC, a number of Israelites were deported to Babylon, including Daniel, who this book is named after. Daniel was a young man, and he kept rising in ranks once he got to Babylon, and he ended up being a major advisor to the king, and we'll see how he plays in just a few minutes. In 597, then, Jerusalem fell to Babylon after they wouldn't continue paying their taxes, their tariffs, to the king of Babylon. And in 586, they tried to take the city back from Babylon, but then King Nebuchadnezzar, the Babylonian king, came and took the city back. And when he did it, he destroyed the temple, which was the religious center for Israel. So Babylon just completely and totally destroyed Israel's heritage, homeland, and they actually took so many of them to Babylon. In fact, this trek was about 1,000 miles, give or take, depending on which route they actually went. And so they took so many Israelites back to Babylon, and that's where they sat in exile for many years. Daniel and a number of the highest class, wealthiest people from Jerusalem end up being captives in King Nebuchadnezzar's Babylon. Now, King Nebuchadnezzar is a very famous Babylonian king. In fact, he oversaw, we believe, the buildings of the Hanging Gardens of Babylon, one of the great wonders of the world the ancient world. So he was an amazing king in many, many respects and led them to many, many victories. And you'll see artistic depictions of him all over the place. This is more of a modern one here, but this is more of an ancient one. He may have looked actually something like this. For those of you who have read the book of Daniel before, you may be aware of the story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego when King Nebuchadnezzar created a giant golden image of himself and commanded all the people to bow down to it. And it was those three Israelites, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, hard to say quickly on a Sunday morning. It was those three Israelites who would not bow down to him and risk their own lives by it. But the story I want to tell you about Nebuchadnezzar this morning, the first of our spooky stories from the Bible, is the story where he actually ended up becoming like a wild animal. And in order to tell this story, I'm very delighted to have a little bit of help this morning from some friends of mine and some family members of mine. And this morning, I want to tell you the spooky story of King Nebuchadnezzar's dream. Once upon, very important. I'm so sorry. I totally forgot the most important piece of this. Okay, now we're ready. Once upon a time, King Nebuchadnezzar had a dream that he could not understand. And so he called all of his astrologers, his magicians, and his fortune tellers throughout the land. King Nebuchadnezzar had a dream, and he told them that there was a giant tree standing up and reaching to the heavens. And this tree was so enormous, and this tree was so helpful, that in fact, this tree had lots of wild animals below it as they were all living off of the tree to live. This had wild Middle Eastern animals, because this happened in the Middle East, and my children actually helped me pick out the specific Middle Eastern animals for us to demonstrate this morning. So this tree had wild animals like a sheep. This tree had wild animals like a pig. This tree had wild Middle Eastern animals like a koala bear. Yes, the Middle East. Famous for its koalas. Koalas run everywhere. Thank you, Will, for helping pick that animal out. So in his dream, he sees these animals and he sees this giant tree, and then an angel appears, a messenger from God in the dream. And this angel says that this tree will be cut down and great will be its fall and everyone will suffer because it is done. So he does not understand this dream, and he calls all of the people of the land who are supposed to know how to interpret it to him, and they are not able to interpret the dream. So finally, he calls Daniel, the young Israelite from Jerusalem, the Jewish wise man, to him to help him interpret the dream. And Daniel is able to do it. And this is what Daniel says. "Oh, live long forever, O King Nebuchadnezzar. I hate to tell you what this dream means. I wish it were about your enemies," he says in fear. "But this is what the dream means, and this is how it is to be interpreted. The tree in your dream that reaches to the heavens and to the skies, that represents you, King Nebuchadnezzar. And the animals that are around the tree, making their wild animal noises." And we'll just demonstrate this real fast. The sheep was making sheep noises. The pig was making pig noises. The koala bear was making koala bear noises. Yeah, we don't know what a koala bear sounds like, so thank you, Will. That was really good. All right, so the animals who are gathered around this tree, they represent all of the peoples on the land who sustain themselves because of your greatness, O king. But you, King Nebuchadnezzar, have allowed your pride to get the best of you. You are puffed up, and you have forgotten that it is the Lord Yahweh, the God of the Jews, who is the one who puts people in their power and gives them their place in this world. So because you have forgotten that, the angel declares to you in this dream that you, like this tree, will be cut down. You will have a mighty fall. And you, like this tree, will cease to be tall and splendid. In fact, you will come out. You will come out. You will come out. The angel can still be there. You will come out. There you go. You will be like a wild animal. Yep, you're almost there. You will be like a wild animal out eating grass from the land like a cow. You will allow the dew of heaven to stay on yourself in the mornings because you will lose your mind and forget who you are. That, O King Nebuchadnezzar, is what the dream means. Thanks, everybody. You can go back now. And so this dream actually comes true. Nebuchadnezzar, like Daniel says, hey, if you'll repent, perhaps this won't happen to you. So now's a great time to repent, but he doesn't. And so sometime later, he's standing on the top of his palace, King Nebuchadnezzar, as he's looking out, surveying the wonders of his land that he has helped create. And he's thinking what a wonderful king he is, how awesome and mighty he is. And suddenly he hears the voice of the messenger from his dream, and he knows that it is time. And so what we see is that King Nebuchadnezzar loses his mind, and just like a wild cow eating from the grass, he starts to think that he's a wild animal. And so they try to shut him up, and they try to like quarantine him off so that people don't understand how crazy he's got. There's actually a bovine madness disease that humans can get psychologically where they think they are a cow. Some scholars believe that this is what God struck him with, but he is like this for some time, perhaps weeks or months or years. It's unclear to us. But eventually he comes to his senses, and when he does so, he realizes that Yahweh, the God of the Jews, is the one true God. And he begins to turn his back on Marduk, the God that he had worshiped, that had given him victory in his mind over Israel. Now, Nebuchadnezzar dies sometime later, and other kings come along in Babylon, but none of them are as great or as smart or as strategically brilliant as Nebuchadnezzar. And so a couple of generations later, King Nabonidus is the king at this time, and he is married to someone in Nebuchadnezzar's bloodline, we think. And so the person, he has a son. His son is Belshazzar, and Belshazzar starts out as second in charge, but King Nabonidus doesn't really like ruling. We don't really know why. Scholars disagree. He's gone for long periods of time, and when he's gone, he actually puts King Belshazzar in charge. And it is Belshazzar that our second story is about this morning, and this is the main event. This is the story we want to focus on, but you have to understand Nebuchadnezzar to understand Belshazzar. A few days before this story we're about to look at from Daniel chapter 5 takes place, King Nabonidus is defeated and killed by the Persian army. As best we can tell, that seems to be what happens, leaving Belshazzar, who was second in command, as king over Babylon. And so the story we're going to look at right now is the story of what happens to King Belshazzar. It is the story of what happens on the night of his death. It was a dark and stormy night. Okay, we don't actually know if it was dark and stormy, but I love the way that sounds. So,
it was a dark and stormy night.
Belshazzar, the acting king of Babylon, sat cozy within the capital city while his enemies, the Persians, gathered outside of the city gates. He was confident that Babylon's walls and gates would prevail, as they always had, that his Persian enemies would find this city to be impenetrable, just like all of Babylon's enemies before them. The Persian army, he assumed, would eventually grow too thirsty, too hungry, or perhaps too cold to continue their siege, and they would abandon the effort before the citizens of Babylon could be harmed. So confident was Belshazzar in the city's defenses that he chose to host an enormous feast while his enemies were crouching at the gate. He invited 1,000 nobles to feast and drink with him in his palace. As the party ramped up and the wine flowed freely, Belshazzar ordered his servants to bring in the gold and silver cups that his grandfather had stolen from the temple in Jerusalem before he destroyed it. So the entire party, his nobles, their wives, his concubines, began drinking from these sacred cups and praising their idols and false gods, making a mockery of the God worshipped by the Jewish people. Now for Belshazzar, his interpretation of what this party represents is pretty straightforward. His grandfather worshipped the god Marduk, and he defeated the Israelites. Therefore, Marduk is the superior god to Yahweh, the God of the Jewish people. Not only that, but Marduk is the God who will protect you from the Persian army amassing outside of your walls. So you feast, and you remember Marduk and the other gods your grandfather worshipped, gods of wood and stone and gold and silver, and you mockingly disparage Yahweh, the God of the Jews, as a way of remembering that Marduk has delivered you results in battle before, and reassuring yourself that he can do it again. So the party ramps up. People are drinking and laughing and making toasts and flirting. The volume keeps increasing, and then suddenly, Belshazzar's face turns sheet white and begins to contort into a silent scream that can't quite escape his lips. One by one, the guests begin to notice that their host is no longer the life of the party. He stands staring at the far wall of the room, unable to make a sound. Finally, his legs give out and he collapses to the ground, but his eyes never stop staring at that wall. The room diverts their attention to the same spot that Belshazzar is staring at. When they see what he saw, their blood turns cold. A human hand has appeared in midair, materialized from some unseen realm. The room has fallen quiet now. The silence is deafening, and each person present, eyes glued to the far wall, mouths agape, looks on as the hand begins to write a message on the plaster of the wall. 1 word, 2 words, 3 words, and then the hand disappears, vanished back to whatever realm it came from. The entire room leans forward, squinting to make out the message. For reasons that aren't easily apparent, the message feels hostile and not friendly. More moments of silence pass, and then all hell breaks loose. It starts with the screams of a few of the concubines, followed by several nobles attempting to dash for the exits. The chaos only persists for a short time, however, before Belshazzar starts shouting, "No one moves! Stop your screaming! Stop your running! Stop your murmuring! Summon the enchanters! Summon the astrologers! Summon the fortune tellers! And have them brought here at once!" And so they come. Each of the king's wise men, those who supposedly have a connection with the divine, those who are supposedly capable of seeing into the future, they are brought before Belshazzar and shown the writing of the ominous hand. The king promises them riches and power if they can read the writing and explain it to him, but with twisted nerves and a fear of retribution. Each enchanter, astrologer, and fortune teller confesses a horrible truth to the king. They can't read the message. They have no idea what it says, and they have no idea what it means. Fear ripples through the crowd. It's hard to believe what they've seen this night, but the evidence of the hand remains before them in plain sight. It's a code they can't crack, a cipher that taunts them. There will be no more celebrating this evening, and their confidence is shaking. The distressing silence of the banquet hall is broken when the queen enters with a message for Belshazzar. "There is a man in your kingdom who has with him the spirit of the holy gods. Your grandfather once made him chief over all the magicians, enchanters, astrologers, and fortune tellers in all of Babylon. This man, Daniel, can interpret dreams, explain riddles, and solve difficult problems. Swallow your pride. Call upon this messenger from Yahweh. He will tell you what the writing means." So Daniel is brought before Belshazzar. The banquet hall is filled with fearful discussion as Daniel enters, each noble processing the events thus far with the people around him. But as Daniel stands before the king, an eerie quiet descends upon the room. Belshazzar, voice still wavering and legs still weak, offers Daniel the same wealth and power for his assistance that he had offered his own royal court. When you have great wealth, it's easy to believe that every problem can be solved with riches. Daniel, now an older man of at least 70 years, says to the king, "Keep your gifts or give them to someone else, but I will tell you what the writing means. Listen, O king. The high God gave your grandfather Nebuchadnezzar a great kingdom and a glorious reputation. Because God made him so famous, people from everywhere, whatever their race, whatever their color, whatever their creed, they were totally and completely intimidated by him. He killed or spared people on whim. He promoted or humiliated people capriciously. His heart and mind were puffed up with arrogance. His spirit hardened. So God knocked him from his royal throne and stripped him of his royal glory. He was thrown out of human company, lost his mind, and lived like a wild animal. He ate grass like an ox and was soaked by heaven's dew until he learned his lesson, that the high God rules human kingdoms and puts anyone he wants in charge. You are his grandson, and you know this story, yet you're as arrogant as he ever was. Look at you. You set yourself up in competition against the master of heaven. You demand the sacred chalices from his temple brought into your drunken party so that you and your nobles, your wives and your concubines can drink from them. You use the cups of Yahweh to toast your gods of silver and gold and bronze and iron and wood and stone, blind, deaf, and imbecile gods. But you treat with contempt the living God who holds your entire life from birth to death in his hand. So God sent the hand that wrote on the wall, and this is what is written: Mene, Tekel, and Paris. This is what the words mean. Mene, God has numbered the days of your reign and has brought it to an end. Tekel, you have been weighed on the scales, and you don't weigh much. Paris, your kingdom has been divided up and handed over to the Medes and Persians who right now crouch outside your gates. Silence fills the banquet hall, finally pierced by the sounds of scattered whimpers and weeping. Unbeknownst to those in attendance, as the party had been ramping up, Persian engineers were working to divert the Euphrates River that entered into the city of Babylon to a swamp outside the gates. As the hand was writing on the wall, the water level of the river had fallen enough that it became possible for an elite team of Persian soldiers to swim underneath the mighty wall of Babylon for a surprise attack on the Babylonian guards. As Daniel was interpreting the words of the hand of God, the Persians were opening the enormous steel gates of Babylon from inside the city. That very night, Belshazzar was killed by the Persian army.
Okay, it's a little much. I know it's a little much, but it's a fascinating story, right? Okay, 3 of you enjoyed it. That's great. So here's the thing about the story, though. It's not just meant for us to read an interesting, fascinating story. It's actually meant to be used as a mirror to hold that story up. So what is Belshazzar's problem? Belshazzar's problem is the same problem as Nebuchadnezzar had, but instead of being teachable, instead of being able to learn, instead of being able to change, he's not. His problem is his pride. So just as a recap, in Daniel chapter 5, Daniel says, Nebuchadnezzar learned that the Most High God rules over the kingdoms of the world and appoints anyone he desires to rule over them. That's who God is. You are his successor. And you knew all this. You know this story, Belshazzar. Yet you have not humbled yourself. For you have proudly defied the Lord of heaven and have had these cups from his temple brought before you. So what we're going to talk about for the remaining 8 to 10 minutes of our time is pride, because that is what this spooky story is actually about. And what's interesting is that none of us actually think we struggle with pride. In fact, outside of Christian circles, we hear how almost no one talk about pride as an issue at all. They're willing to admit to all kinds of other things. They're willing to admit to being cheap, or being adulterous, or to being a thief. They're willing to admit to, having an alcohol addiction or a problem with thievery or any kind of thing. Like people are willing to say, oh, I'm a workaholic. Oh, I struggle with details. People are willing to admit all kinds of faults, but almost no one thinks that they struggle with pride. But within Christian circles, it has long been understood that pride is at the center of most sin. And so it becomes the thing we have to actually wrestle with. Interestingly enough, when we see somebody who has a problem with pride, we immediately feel just repulsed by that. Like when someone always talking about themselves or showing off or has an air about them, you tell they just think that they're better than everyone else. That is one of the most repulsive things that we can spot in someone else, but we struggle to see it in ourselves. C.S. Lewis, in his book, Mere Christianity, says this: according to Christian teachers, the essential vice, the utmost evil is pride. Unchastity, anger, greed, drunkenness, and all of that, they are mere flea bites in comparison. Pride leads to every other vice. It is the complete anti-God state of mind. Why is it anti-God? Because pride says, I can earn my own significance. I can earn my own way. I don't need God. It was the initial sin that we read in Genesis in the Garden of Eden between Adam and Eve. It came down to pride. And all of us have to look pride in the face at some point and recognize that it resides within us as well. So I just want to talk for a few minutes about the cost of pride, and then we'll be done. 4 major costs of pride, and we will all see this. And the first one will be a little bit surprising to you. The first cost of pride is feelings of inferiority. Now, I know that this seems like the opposite of what pride would do, but it's actually because of our own pride that those of us who struggle with feelings of inferiority feel inferior. And again, all of us have pride, so I'm not trying to call any particular person out. This is a thing that we all wrestle with. I'll give you a good example of this. My wife is an amazing mom. She's a great mom. And she cares for our kids so well. She's creative. She's a wonderful nurse. She oversees infection prevention at her hospital. Like she does such an amazing job. But she can start to feel inferior when she starts to log onto social media and scroll through Instagram. And it feels like, oh man, look at these other moms. There are never any dirty dishes in their house. There are never any dirty clothes in their house. They each work 42 hours a day and still get home and completely take care of their family. Like, it's unbelievable. And you start to feel like, oh, I thought I was doing pretty well in this, but look at all these other people. They're doing better, because all of us compare ourselves to everybody else all of the time. That's our natural default setting. And so when we see someone else who, at least by all appearances, does better than us, has it more together than us, achieves more than us, our pride starts to make us feel like, oh, we're actually not that significant. We're actually not as good at that as we thought we were. We start to feel inferior. On the flip side of that, right? Pride can give you feelings of superiority. If you actually feel like you are the best, or you are the smartest person in the room, or nobody sees it quite as clearly as you start to feel like that. Most of us have the emotional intelligence, by the way, not to declare that to everybody all the time, okay? We figured that part out. The challenge is, if you really feel superior to most other people that you come into contact with, that is a stink you will give off even if you thought you put superiority deodorant on, okay? Like, people can smell through that thing. So if you are giving that off, like, that has a feel to it, and then obviousness to it. Like, you're going to lack a certain vulnerability. You're going to lack a certain curiosity, and people are just going to figure that out. Pride can give you a feeling of superiority, and that's a major cost, because there's a relational cost to this feeling of superiority. Now, pride is also the root of all kinds of stuff that's been unhealthy over the course of human history. Pride, for instance, is the root of nationalism. Like, which country, many citizens of every country that has ever existed have thought to themselves that their country was the best country. Pride makes you think that. Why do I know that this country is the best country? Because I'm here. And any country that would have me must be the best country, right? That's just kind of how we think. Now, is that the actual line of thought that goes through our head? No. But we start to like, oh, the people I know are great people. Like, we are so awesome. Like, there's a pride that can swell up and make you think that, therefore, anything your nation does must be fine, must be good, because you're the greatest. You're the best. If anybody else did it, that might be wrong. But your nation specifically, you have it together. So pride ends up being kind of the source of nationalism. Pride is the source of war. Right, this idea that we can't be disrespected, people can't go against us, we have to take control of the situation. I'll give you a little personal insight into a little bitty war. This has nothing to do with the whole nation, just a little war that you fight probably most days. I want to talk for just a moment about road rage, okay? Because road rage, I've been honest, is something that I struggled with for many, many years, and I'm not saying I never struggle with it anymore, but this understanding that pride was at the center of my road rage is what very much helped me overcome those feelings of road rage. And here's how it goes, right? Somebody cuts you off in traffic, and you feel like, they have offended me, they have offended my family, they have offended everyone I have ever, right? I have to get this straight. So I need to cut them back off, right? To let them know that I know what they did, right? I have to lay on my horn, or I have to show them one of my digits. Like, I have to make sure that they know that I know what they did, right? And that's road rage. There's a pride thing there. Or you want to go faster than the person's going. And after a while, you just get so irritated that they would dare hinder you. Who are they to hinder you as you're trying to get to 7-Eleven to get your slushie, right? Who are they? So you zip around them, maybe illegally, maybe you put other people in danger. There's a pride thing there, like, I will not let their slowness affect my schedule. So what happens when you start to realize, like, oh, so much of road rage is about pride, or me being offended at someone I will probably never see or come in contact with again. When you start to realize that, you start to like, oh, like, I could be a few more minutes late, and like, it would be okay. Or I don't have to take it as a personal slight that person didn't notice me as they were getting over, or even that they did and they did it anyway. I don't have to choose to allow my pride, my ego to run that particular narrative. If you start to realize that, you start to realize, oh, this is why nations go to war, right? Oh, we are so offended at what you did here, so we will retaliate in this way. And we are so offended, we retaliate that way. And listen, I know that it's way more complicated than that, and I don't think there is a solution to nations choosing to go to war over pride. Nations have been doing this ever since nations have existed, and nations will continue to do this until God comes and renews and restores and reconciles all things. But for followers of Jesus, for Christians, put their faith in God, there's a way of going like, oh, the pride that costs in so many ways doesn't have to rule and reign my life. There's also a pride of tribalism. If you're a part of a team, if you're a part of a religion, if you're a part of a political party, there's a tribalism that happens. It's like a narcissism, but instead of personal narcissism, it's narcissism for the group. It's not I'm the greatest, we're the greatest. It's not I'm the best, we're the best. It's not that person is wrong. It's like anyone who's not in my group is wrong, and then therefore they are the enemy. That's a pride thing that becomes about tribalism. Pride is behind racism, thinking that your race is better or that someone else's race is worse because you are part of a race that has to be the best. Pride is also, and this is very important, the impulse behind hipsters. Now, I want to talk about hipsters for just a second, okay? Because hipsters were really popular in the early 2000s, up until about 2010, 2014 maybe, and now hipsters have basically disappeared off the face of the planet. But what hipsters were all about was, we see through the veneer that the rest of you don't. We're unique. That thing that you think is cool isn't cool, but we're going to wear it anyway. But ironically, we know that we don't mean it when we wear it because we're different, right? It was all about being different, all about being unique. And then hipsterism died. In fact, there's a hipster named Adam Groffman who wrote a hipster website for hipsters by a hipster. And Adam Groffman, a few years ago, wrote this about the death of hipsterism. He says, the demise of the hipster was inevitable. They became victims of their own popularity. Their quest for uniqueness led to a paradoxical uniformity, where everyone tried to stand out by blending in, right? What happened to the hipsters? Hipsters became too popular. And then the thing that made being a hipster cool wasn't cool anymore. So they moved on to Taylor Swift. No, I don't know what they moved on to. They moved on, okay? Not really a thing anymore, right? What started that? This pride, this idea that like, I see what's really ironic. I see what's really cool. I see like the rest of you don't, but I do. My group of friends do. We get it. And over a pretty short period of time, they all started dressing alike, acting alike, listening to the same music, which I'm thankful. They introduced me to a lot of bands, indie bands that I wouldn't have known otherwise, right? The hipsters, you did good work for a while, okay? Thank you for your service. But eventually, this led to their own demise. Of course, that's always the way it was going to go. Why? Because this idea of pride is always comparing. It's not just about having the most or being the most unique. It's about being more unique than everyone else. Having more than everyone else. Pastor Tim Keller says it this way. Pride is the pleasure of having more than the next person. Pride is the pleasure of being more than the next person. It's always comparative, and therefore, it always drives a wedge in relationships. Because pride says, I'm comparing myself to you all the time, and you're comparing yourself to me all the time. And so much of our actions ends up getting driven by pride. Now, interestingly, the last cost I want to talk about of pride is an inability to grasp the gospel. Because pride says, I don't need help from Jesus. I do this myself. In other words, the gospel says, right, if you read through Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, if you read through the New Testament, the gospel says that every single person, all of us, have too much sin and brokenness and darkness in our lives to have right relationship with a completely holy God. There's a chasm between us and God. And the only one who can close the chasm is God. And so God sent Jesus to deal with the thing that created this chasm, which was our own sin and brokenness. Now, pride says, I'm not any more sinful or any more broken than the next person. In fact, I'm better than a lot of people that I know. I don't need someone doing something for me to help me out because I've got it myself. That's what pride says. So whenever you've shared that Jesus actually comes and reconnects you to God to someone, if they felt totally unmoved, a huge reason probably for that is because of their own pride. They're not able to see, just like none of us are at some point in our life. They're not able to see just how deep their darkness and sin and brokenness actually is. What the gospel tells us is that Jesus took all of our sin, all of our darkness, all of our brokenness. And by the way, if sin feels like a weird concept to you or a far-fetched concept, just think of a time in your life where you wish you would have acted differently. Think about the time when you brought sorrow to a friendship or when you broke someone's heart in a way that, like, if you could have that moment back, you would do it differently. That's the kind of brokenness, that's the kind of sin, that's the kind of darkness that we're talking about. Putting yourself over others, which is also a matter of pride, a seeking out of your own significance. And Jesus came to take that sin, that brokenness, that darkness on himself. He allowed it to kill him actually on the cross. And when he raised from the dead, he overcame our sin, our brokenness, and our darkness. He broke the bonds of our sin, our brokenness, and our darkness. That's what Jesus' death and resurrection accomplishes, therefore wiping out the chasm between us and God. And if you don't see the beauty of that or the need that you have in your life for that kind of restoration, that kind of love, the likely reason for that is because you've never actually come face to face with the sense of your own pride. So you read a story, I read a story like Belshazzar, and we're like, oh yeah, that king was prideful. That guy is the worst, right? And we don't realize that what we're reading is actually a mirror that we are to hold up to ourselves, that all of us are Belshazzar and all of us struggle with pride. The gospel says, you do not have to find your significance in what you achieve, or in what you accomplish, or in who shows you love. You do not have to find your significance there because Jesus paid a price so that you could be adopted into the family of God, have right relationship with him. And no matter how long or short your life is, no matter what you achieve or do not achieve in the eyes of the world, your significance comes from who you are, a son or a daughter of God. And if you choose to place your faith in what Jesus did for you, then you are adopted into the family, and that is all the significance you will ever need. On this Halloweekend, when we read spooky stories, it's not just for the sake of scaring ourselves. It's for the sake of learning about ourselves and learning about God. Each of us faces the pride monster. The question is, will we trust in Jesus to slay the monster? Father, thank you for our time together today. Thank you for what Jesus did on the cross. Thank you for the lessons that we learned from Belshazzar and from Daniel. God, thank you for the lessons that we learned from Nebuchadnezzar. Lord, we're so grateful for these stories because they help shape how we think of you and how we think of ourselves. I pray, God, if we've not come face to face with our own pride, our own need to have our ego stoked or Lord, to find our significance in anything but you, God, would you allow us to see that this weekend? And to confront that monster, God, not to slay it ourselves, but to give it over to you. May what Jesus accomplished through Calvary wipe us clean, give us our significance, and turn our hearts toward you. It's in Jesus' name we pray. Amen.